Elias Ward had lived alone on the open Texas plains for so long that the silence had become part of him, like an old coat he had worn for years and no longer noticed. He was a middle-aged cowboy with lines on his face from the sun, a calm look in his eyes, and slow, steady movements that showed he lived life at his own pace. People in the nearest town knew him as the quiet man who came in only when he needed supplies, nodded politely, and left before anyone could say too much. Nobody knew much about him, and Elias liked it that way. A man who kept to himself had fewer things that could hurt him. 9 years earlier, life had looked very different. Elias had once shared his ranch with his wife, a gentle woman who loved wildflowers and laughed easily. Their son, Daniel, had grown up riding ponies and chasing rabbits across the field behind their old barn. The house had held warm meals, soft music from a radio, and the kind of conversations people take for granted until they disappear. But when Elias lost his wife to illness, the house became quiet in a way that felt heavy. Daniel, who was young and hurting, eventually left to live in the city, searching for a life that didn't remind him of loss. Elias understood why, but the absence still carved an empty space inside him. The ranch was big enough for 2 people, maybe even 3. For one man alone, it felt endless. Every morning, Elias woke before sunrise because old habits stayed with him. He brewed coffee that tasted stronger when sipped in silence and stepped outside to feed the horses and check the fences. The plains stretched out in every direction, long waves of grass, soft hills, and a sky that seemed to go on forever. To some, it might have looked lonely. To Elias, it was home. And it was the only place where he felt he could breathe. His days followed a simple rhythm. He worked with his cattle, fixed anything that broke, and ate simple meals he cooked himself. He didn't dislike people. He just didn't know how to talk anymore. Words felt strange coming out of his mouth unless he was talking to his animals. He often spoke to his old horse, Maple, a brown mare with calm eyes that had carried him across the plains for many years. Maple never judged, never hurried him, and never expected more than he could give. In a way, she was his closest friend. Though Elias rarely spoke, his mind was full of thoughts. He noticed everything: the slight change in the wind that told him a storm was coming, the color of the grass that told him how the season was shifting, the small tracks on the hard ground that told him a rabbit or coyote had passed by. Living alone had sharpened his senses. It also made him reflect more than he wanted to. Some nights, when the wind pushed against the windows, he would sit by the fire and wonder about the life he had once dreamed of. He thought about all the things he had planned to do with his wife: planting a bigger garden, visiting her sister in New Mexico, teaching their son to play guitar. Now, those dreams lived only inside his memory. People sometimes drove past the ranch and saw smoke rising from his chimney. They wondered how a man could live alone for so long. Some admired him, others pitied him, but nobody understood that solitude felt safer to Elias than opening his heart again. He had lived through loss, and loss had taught him that the fewer connections a man had, the less he had to lose. So he kept a quiet distance from everyone. He sold cattle when the season called for it, bought supplies when he needed them, and returned to the ranch before the sun touched the horizon. The town was only a 40-minute drive, but he visited maybe once every few weeks. Even there, his life was predictable. He parked his pickup truck near the general store, greeted the owner with a small smile, bought what he needed, and left without lingering. The people were friendly, but they respected his quiet nature. Some of them had known him when his wife was alive and remembered how different he used to be. They spoke kindly to him now, careful not to ask too many questions or bring up the past. Elias appreciated that more than he ever said. One evening, after finishing his chores, Elias sat on his porch with a warm cup of coffee. The sun was dipping behind the hills, painting the sky with soft oranges and pinks. It was moments like this that reminded him why he stayed. The quiet wasn't always heavy. Sometimes it was peaceful, like a blanket wrapped around him. The view never changed much, yet it comforted him more than anything else. He watched a family of quail move through the tall grass, the small chicks following their mother in a neat line. The simple beauty of it made him smile, though only slightly. After the sun set, he went inside, lit the oil lamp, and sat in his worn armchair near the fireplace. The house was old but sturdy, built with strong wooden beams his grandfather had placed with his own hands. Elias loved the history in those walls. It made him feel connected to something larger than himself. But even the warmth of history couldn't fill the silence completely. Some nights, the quiet seemed to echo inside the house, reminding him how empty it had become. Still, Elias didn't complain. He believed life gave every person a path, and this quiet, lonely path was his. He accepted it with the same calmness he used to face difficult weather or long cattle drives. He never expected anything to change. In his mind, the future looked the same as the present, a long string of peaceful days, hard work, and quiet nights. Nothing new, nothing surprising. Yet deep down, beneath the layers of routine and solitude, a small part of him still carried a quiet hope he didn't fully understand. It showed itself in little ways, like the letters he wrote to his son but never mailed, or the extra plate he kept in the cupboard though he dined alone. Sometimes he found himself imagining a different life, one where laughter filled the house again. But he pushed those thoughts aside as soon as they appeared, telling himself they belonged to the past. As winter approached that year, the weather turned colder than usual. The wind came down from the north, bringing a chill that crept into every corner of the ranch. Elias stacked firewood near the porch, checked the barn doors twice, and made sure his animals were warm enough. The cold season had never bothered him much before, but this year it felt sharper. Maybe it was because he was older, or maybe the silence felt heavier in winter. Whatever the reason, he worked harder to keep busy. One night, as he listened to the wind move through the trees, he felt a strange sense that something was shifting, not in the weather, but in his life. He didn't know what it was, and the feeling was so faint that he almost ignored it. But it stayed with him, like a quiet whisper he could not quite understand. Elias had no way of knowing that soon, his life would change in a way he never expected. After 9 long years of being alone, someone would appear at his doorstep, a woman seeking warmth on a cold winter night. And without meaning to, she would bring warmth back into his life too, in ways he had stopped believing were possible. But on this night, before any of that happened, Elias sat by his fire, unaware of how close he was to the end of his long solitude. All he knew was the steady crackle of the fire, the hum of the wind outside, and the quiet rhythm of a life he thought would never change. The winter night arrived earlier than usual, quietly but firmly, like a guest who didn't bother to knock. All day the air had been cold, but by evening the temperature dropped so sharply that even Elias felt it through his coat. He had lived on the ranch long enough to understand weather better than most people. When the wind changed direction and the clouds moved low across the sky, he knew something strong was coming. Still, he was calm. Winter storms were nothing new to him. Before sunset, he went outside to chop extra wood. His breaths turned white in the air. The sky looked heavy, as if it was holding back something. Elias didn't rush, he rarely did, but his movements were steady and careful. The ranch had taught him patience. He stacked the wood neatly on the porch, counting the logs even though he didn't need to. It was a habit, something he did to keep his mind steady. When he finished, he looked across the long stretch of land. The wind blew across the fields, bending the tall, dry grass. Everything looked quiet, almost too quiet. Elias stood there for a moment, letting the cold wrap around him. He had lived through many winters, but there was something different about this one. Maybe it was the loneliness that felt sharper in the cold. Maybe it was the silence that seemed heavier in the winter air. He could not explain it, but he sensed a shift, small, but real. He went inside, warmed his hands by the stove, and fixed himself a simple dinner. The house was warm, but outside, the wind grew louder. It brushed against the windows, almost tapping at the glass. Elias didn't mind the sound. It was familiar. He ate slowly, listening to the wind as if it were talking to him in its own quiet language. When he finished, he washed the dishes, set them back on the shelf, and put on his heavy jacket to check on the animals one last time. The moment he stepped outside, the cold hit him harder than before. The wind had grown stronger in just an hour. Snowflakes floated down, light at first but steady. Maple, his horse, stood in her stall with calm eyes, as if she trusted him to take care of everything. He checked her hay and patted her neck gently. "You stay warm," he murmured softly, though he rarely spoke out loud. He checked the other animals too, making sure they were safe and comfortable. When he walked back toward the house, he paused for a moment. Turning his face toward the open field, something caught his attention, a faint shape moving far out near the fence line. He squinted through the snow, but the wind pushed against his eyes, making it hard to see. He told himself it was probably nothing. The snow and darkness could trick the eyes easily. Still, he watched for a bit longer. The shape disappeared behind a patch of tall grass. Elias shook his head, deciding it must have been the wind or a small animal. He headed back inside and sat by the fire. The storm was getting stronger. Snow tapped against the windows like small fingers, and the wind whistled through the cracks of the old house. He should have relaxed, but the memory of the moving shape lingered in his mind. It wasn't fear. Elias was not a man who scared easily. It was more like curiosity, mixed with a quiet worry that he tried to ignore. After all, no one should be walking around in this weather. The nearest house was miles away, and the storm was growing too strong for anyone to be traveling. He pushed the thought aside until a sudden noise startled him, a soft, distant thud. It wasn't the sound of something falling inside the house. It came from outside. Elias set down his coffee and stood up slowly, listening closely. The wind howled, the house creaked, and then another sound. Softer this time, but real. Without hesitating, he grabbed his coat and stepped out onto the porch. The cold hit him again, sharper than before. Snow had already begun to gather along the edges of the steps. He looked around, scanning the open space. At first, he saw nothing unusual, just the white blanket forming across the ground. Then he heard it, a weak voice, almost too faint to catch. "Hello?" Elias's eyes focused, and his heart gave a small, unexpected jump. There, near the edge of the fence line, lay a figure. Someone was on the ground, struggling to lift themselves. The snow made everything blurry, but he could see the outline of a person, small, hunched, and clearly exhausted. He hurried forward, his boots sinking into the soft snow. As he reached the figure, he saw a woman curled against the fence, shivering so hard that her shoulders shook. Her hair was dark and pulled back loosely, and her clothes were thin, not made for this weather. Her cheeks were red from the cold, and her lips trembled. She lifted her head slightly when she heard him approach. "Please, I just need warmth," she whispered, her voice weak and strained. "Just for the night. Please." She spoke softly, not demanding anything, only asking with the kind of humility that came from real need. Elias knelt beside her, careful not to frighten her. He could see that she had been walking for a long time. Snow covered her shoes and the lower part of her pants. She looked tired, but there was strength in her eyes, even in her weakness. "My truck broke down," she said quietly, her breath clouding in the air. "I tried to walk to find help, but the cold." She lowered her gaze, embarrassed to be so helpless. Elias felt something shift inside him, something he hadn't felt in years. Concern, responsibility, a quiet urge to protect someone. He didn't question her story. The storm was enough proof, and even if he had questions, this was not the time to ask them. "Come on," he said gently. "Let's get you warm." He helped her stand, supporting her as she leaned against him. She was light, but he felt how exhausted her legs were. She tried to walk on her own, but stumbled once. Gripping his arm, Elias steadied her without hesitation. They reached the porch slowly, step by careful step. When he opened the door, the warm air rushed out to greet them. He guided her inside, closing the door behind them to keep the cold out. The woman stood near the entryway, her eyes adjusting to the dim light. "Sit by the fire," Elias said softly, pointing to the armchair closest to the fireplace. "I'll get a blanket." She nodded gratefully and moved slowly toward the fire. Her hands were trembling so much that she had trouble unbuttoning her coat. Elias returned with a thick wool blanket and wrapped it around her shoulders. She held it tightly, as if afraid the warmth might disappear. "Thank you," she whispered, her eyes shining with relief. Elias warmed water on the stove and made her tea. When he handed her the mug, she held it close, letting the steam warm her face. She took small sips, breathing in slowly. The color returned to her cheeks little by little. "My name is Naya," she said after a moment, her voice steadier now. "I'm Comanche. I was traveling to visit family, but my truck stopped working, and my phone died. I didn't think the cold would come so fast." Elias nodded quietly. He didn't interrupt or rush her. He simply listened the way he hadn't listened to anyone in years. "I thought I could reach the main road," she continued, "but the wind made it hard to walk. When I saw your fence, I hoped someone lived here." "You're safe now," Elias said gently. "You can stay here until the storm passes." Naya smiled, a soft, tired smile filled with gratitude. Something in that smile touched Elias in a place he thought had gone numb long ago. Outside, the storm raged on, stronger than before. Inside, the fire cracked softly, filling the room with warmth. And in that warmth, two strangers, one who had lived alone for nearly a decade and one who had come seeking help, found themselves sharing the same quiet space. Elias did not know it yet, but this night would mark the beginning of a change he could never have predicted. A gentle shift, a new chapter, a warmth he had not felt in years. It all started on a bitter winter night when a tired woman knocked not on his door, but on his heart, with a simple request for warmth. The storm outside showed no sign of slowing down. Snow pressed against the windows, and the wind moved around the house like a restless visitor trying to find a way inside. Elias added more wood to the fire and watched the flames rise, warm and bright. Naya sat close to the heat, wrapped in the blanket he had given her, her hands cupped around the mug of tea. Little by little, the trembling in her fingers eased, and the color returned to her face. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The quiet inside the house felt different from the usual silence Elias lived with. This silence was shared, not empty. It was gentle, almost comforting. Elias wasn't used to having another person in his home, especially after so many years alone. Yet he didn't feel uncomfortable. Instead, he felt something he hadn't felt in a very long time. Presence. Someone else breathing softly, warming their hands, existing in the same space. It felt strange, but pleasant. Naya lifted her eyes and met his gaze. "Thank you again," she said softly. "I didn't know if I would make it to any house in time." Elias nodded. "I'm glad you did." He wasn't a man of many words, but those few words carried sincerity. Naya seemed to sense that, and she smiled. It was a small smile, tired, but kind. "May I ask your name?" she said gently. "Elias," he replied. "Elias Ward," she repeated it quietly, as if learning the shape of the name. "Thank you, Elias Ward." Elias felt something shift inside him at the sound of his name spoken by another person. Something warm and almost forgotten. It had been years since someone new had spoken to him like that, calmly, respectfully, without hurry. He pulled up a chair across from the fire, giving her space but not too far away. "How long were you walking?" he asked. "Maybe 3 hours," she answered, thinking back. "I tried to stay on the road, but the snow made it hard to see. When the wind started picking up, I realized I needed to find shelter fast." "Did anyone know you were traveling?" Elias asked. "My sister," Naya said. "I told her I'd make it by tonight. But when my phone died, I lost track of how far I had gone. I'm sure she's worried, but I'll call her in the morning." Elias nodded. He didn't want her to worry more about her family tonight. She needed warmth and rest. "You can stay here until it's safe," he reminded her. "This storm might last all night." "Thank you," she said again, her voice softer. I didn't expect to find help in the middle of nowhere. Elias glanced toward the window. Not many folks pass through here, he said honestly. But you found the one old ranch house still standing. Naya laughed softly, a sound gentle enough to fit perfectly between the popping of the firewood. Then I'm lucky. Her laugh surprised him. It had been so long since laughter filled his home that he almost forgot what it sounded like. It warmed the air in a different way than the fire. Elias didn't laugh often, but he felt his chest lighten a little. He noticed the snow melting in her hair. You should dry off, he said. If you'd like, I can bring you a towel. I'd appreciate that, she said. He stood and went to the linen closet. When he returned with a towel, she thanked him and began drying her hair gently. Her movements were slow, careful, as if she didn't want to disturb the calmness of the room. As she worked, Elias studied her in a respectful, quiet way. She had a calm strength about her, a peaceful presence that reminded him of the open plains after a long rainfall. He realized she wasn't just tired, she was brave. Walking alone through a winter storm took more courage than most people had. After a few minutes, Naya lowered the towel and took another sip of her warm tea. I work as a nurse, she said, almost casually, as if trying to explain why she had handled the situation so calmly. I'm used to long hours, unexpected things happening. Though I've never walked through a snowstorm like this before. A nurse, Elias repeated thoughtfully. That's a good thing to be. She smiled at his simple honesty. What about you? You're a rancher? He nodded. All my life. My father and grandfather were ranchers too. The land's been in the family for years. Do you live here alone? She asked gently. The question was simple, but it touched something sensitive inside Elias. He wasn't offended. He just wasn't used to talking about himself. Still, he answered quietly, yes, been alone for some time. Naya didn't press further. She nodded with understanding, giving him space to share only what he wished. Elias appreciated that more than he could say. Most people asked too many questions, but she asked softly and listened carefully, without pushing him. He felt safe enough to say a little more. Used to live here with my family. Her expression warmed with empathy. I'm sorry, she said kindly, without assuming anything. Elias nodded once. Grateful, she didn't push deeper. He didn't want to open old memories just yet, not with someone he barely knew. But something about her presence made him feel he could talk. When he was ready. Maybe later. Maybe not. Either way, she didn't make him feel rushed. Naya shifted a little in the chair, settling comfortably. Your home feels peaceful, she said softly. Even with the storm outside, it feels safe. The words surprised Elias. He looked around the living room, the old wooden beams, the simple furniture, the woven blanket draped over the couch, the photos on the wall that he kept there, even though he rarely looked at them. To him, the house had become a quiet place, almost too quiet. He didn't think of it as warm. But hearing her say it made him see his home differently for a moment. I'm glad you feel that way, he said. They fell into a gentle silence again. This time it wasn't awkward. It was almost peaceful, as if the storm outside had created a cocoon around the house, forcing them to slow down and simply exist. After a few minutes, Naya looked toward the window. Do storms like this happen often here? Not always, Elias answered. But when they do, they come strong. It's best to stay put, she nodded. I can see that now. He stood up. Are you hungry? I can make something simple. Naya hesitated, not wanting to trouble him. But her empty stomach gave her away. If it's not too much trouble, it's no trouble, Elias replied. He went to the kitchen and began warming up soup. The kind he made in large batches and kept frozen for winter nights like this. As the smell filled the house, Naya closed her eyes briefly, letting the warmth and aroma calm her further. When the soup was ready, Elias handed her a bowl. She held it carefully, appreciating not just the food but the small kindness behind it. This is good, she said after a few bites. It's simple, Elias replied. They ate quietly, the fire crackling softly beside them. When they finished, Elias set the bowls aside and returned to his chair. You must be tired, he said gently. You can rest here. The storm won't let up any time soon. Naya nodded. I am tired. But talking like this has helped. I didn't expect to feel so calm after the day I had. Elias looked into the fire. Sometimes talking helps, he said quietly, almost to himself. She smiled at him kindly. Thank you for talking with me. That simple statement touched him deeply. He had forgotten what it felt like to share a conversation with someone, to have another person look at him and speak with warmth. As the night grew older, they continued talking slowly, naturally, about simple things. Naya told him about her work, her love for helping people. The stories her grandmother told her when she was young. Elias shared small pieces of ranch life. How the seasons changed the land. How he named each horse. How he fixed fences after storms. Little details, but meaningful. Time passed without either of them noticing. The storm still howled outside, but inside the house, a softer kind of warmth grew. One made not by fire, but by the gentle connection forming between two strangers who had no reason to meet except for a broken truck and a winter storm. Elias, who had spent 9 years speaking mostly to horses and walls, found himself speaking more that night than he had in a long time. And Naya, who had walked through freezing wind with fear and uncertainty, found unexpected comfort in a quiet cowboy's presence. Neither of them knew what tomorrow would bring. But for the moment, they had found something rare in the middle of a storm: understanding. The winter storm stayed through the night. And by morning, the world outside Elias's home looked completely different. A thick layer of snow covered the ground, soft and white like a giant blanket spread across the plains. The wind had finally quieted, but the air was still cold, sharp enough to sting the skin. Inside the house, however, the fire was still warm, and the atmosphere felt peaceful. Naya woke slowly, wrapped in the blanket Elias had given her. She had fallen asleep in the armchair by the fire, too tired to move anywhere else. Elias had let her rest, checking on her now and then to make sure she was comfortable. He himself had slept lightly on the couch, waking several times to add more wood to the fire so the room stayed warm. When Naya opened her eyes, Elias was already up. He stood by the window, looking out at the snow-covered land. He didn't move much. He simply watched, as if reading the sky. She could tell this was a familiar routine for him, a man who understood the land like it was an old friend. Good morning, she said softly, her voice still quiet from sleep. Elias turned toward her with a small nod. Morning. How are you feeling? A little stiff, she admitted with a smile, but much better than last night. You slept well, Elias said. The storm kept us here, but the fire helped. Naya looked at the flames still dancing gently in the fireplace. The warmth reached her toes, and she sighed softly. Your home really saved me. He didn't respond right away. Compliments always made him a little shy. Finally, he said, anyone would have helped. You were cold. You needed a safe place. Naya shook her head. Not everyone would have opened the door at night for a stranger. Elias didn't know how to answer that. To him, it had been simple: someone needed warmth, and his home had warmth to give. But hearing her say it made him realize that she was right. Many people would hesitate. Many people might not notice a stranger in the storm at all. He cleared his throat softly. Are you hungry? I can fix something. That would be wonderful, she said, stretching her arms. Elias made breakfast eggs, warm bread, and a pot of coffee that filled the house with a rich smell. Naya helped by setting the table, though she still moved slowly because her legs were tired from all the walking the night before. As they ate, the morning sun filtered through the fog outside, creating a soft golden glow on the snow. It made everything look calm and clean, as if the storm had washed away the world's noise. So, the road looks pretty blocked, Naya said, glancing toward the window. Most likely, Elias agreed. It'll take a day or two before it clears. "That means I'm staying here again?" she asked, though her tone held no worry, only curiosity. "If you're comfortable," Elias replied. "You're welcome here." Naya smiled warmly. "I am comfortable." That simple statement made something flutter in Elias's chest, something he tried to ignore but couldn't entirely. He wasn't used to having company, especially someone who made the room feel full of life just by being there. After breakfast, they bundled up in coats and stepped outside. The cold hit them instantly, but it was the kind of cold that made cheeks pink and breaths rise like smoke. Elias walked ahead, showing Naya where the snow was shallow enough to step. The entire ranch looked different under its white coat. "It's beautiful," Naya said, taking in the wide, bright landscape. "It is," Elias agreed quietly. "Winter changes everything." He led her to the barn first, checking on the animals. Maple, his horse, nickered softly when she saw him. Naya watched him move around the barn, feeding the animals and checking the water trough. He did it with such calmness and care that she couldn't help but admire him. "You take good care of them," she said. "They've been with me for years," Elias replied. "They depend on me." Naya reached out to pat Maple's neck. The horse leaned into her hand, surprising her. "She's gentle. She's gentle. She likes people who are calm," Elias said, watching the two of them. Naya smiled, giving Maple one more gentle stroke. Together, they worked through the morning. Elias showed her how to gather fresh hay, how to close the barn doors against the wind, and how to break the thin layer of ice that formed on the water trough. Naya followed his instructions, learning quickly. She was used to helping others, so helping with the ranch work felt natural. At one point, Elias noticed her shivering slightly. "Let's head inside before you freeze," he said. They returned to the house and warmed their hands by the fire. Naya sighed with relief as the heat soaked into her palms. "It feels good to move," she said. "But the cold here is stronger than I expected." "It can surprise you," Elias said. "Even people who grew up here respect this weather." Naya sat down, wrapping the blanket around herself again. "Do you ever get tired of living alone?" she asked gently. Elias paused. The question touched a place he rarely visited. He sat slowly in the chair across from her. "Sometimes," he admitted quietly. "The silence gets heavy in winter." Naya nodded with understanding. "I can imagine. Silence is peaceful, but too much of it can feel lonely." Elias looked into the fire. "I got used to it, maybe more than I should have." Naya studied him thoughtfully, her eyes soft. "You're kind, Elias. You have a gentle way about you. I don't think you were meant to live completely alone." He wasn't used to words like that. Kind, gentle. He didn't see himself that way. He saw himself as a man who kept going because he had to, not because he was strong or special. "I don't know about that," he said quietly. "I do," she replied with quiet certainty. Their eyes met then just for a moment, but long enough for both of them to feel something shift again. Not loud or dramatic, just a quiet warmth, like the fire warming the room. Later, when the sun began to lower in the sky, they stepped outside again. The storm clouds had faded, leaving a soft blue above. The snow sparkled like crushed glass under the afternoon light. Elias showed Naya how to check the fence line. She walked beside him, their footsteps leaving long trails behind them. The air was cold, but their shared company made the walk feel easy. At one point, Naya slipped slightly on a patch of hidden ice. Elias reached out instinctively, steadying her with his hand on her arm. "You all right?" he asked. She nodded, laughing softly. "I'm learning your land one step at a time." Elias's hand stayed on her arm a second longer than necessary before he let go. He didn't mean to hold on, but some part of him didn't want to move too quickly. As the day came to an end, they returned to the warm house. Elias cooked again, and Naya helped chop vegetables. Their movements around each other became more natural, almost comfortable, as if they had been doing this for years. After dinner, they sat by the fire once more. The house felt warmer, fuller, quieter, in a soft way rather than an empty way. They talked about small things, her childhood, his grandfather's stories, the shape of the stars in winter. At one point, Naya looked around the cozy room. "It's strange," she said softly, "but I feel like I've known this place longer than one night." Elias felt his heart move again. "I'm glad it feels that way." When the fire softened into glowing embers, Elias checked the weather again. "The roads might open tomorrow," he said, "if the sun stays out." Naya nodded slowly. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then she looked at him with a gentle sadness in her eyes. "That's good," she said quietly. "But I didn't expect to feel sad about leaving." Elias didn't know how to answer. His chest tightened, not painfully, but knowingly. He didn't want her to leave either, though he wasn't sure how to say it. In the soft glow of the fading fire, two people who had spent the day working side by side sat quietly, realizing something was changing. Something neither of them had expected, and just like the warmth of the fire, it spread slowly, gently, into a part of Elias's life that had been cold for far too long. The next morning arrived slowly, as if the sun itself was unsure whether to rise. Pale light slipped across the snow-covered land, making everything look calm and untouched. Inside the house, the fire had burned down to soft embers, giving the room a gentle warmth. Elias woke first, as he always did. He stretched quietly, careful not to make too much noise. Last night had been long, but peaceful, a kind of peace he hadn't felt in years. He walked to the window, pulling back the curtain just enough to see outside. The sky was clear, soft blue with a few pale clouds drifting lazily. The storm had passed completely, leaving behind stillness that felt almost delicate. He could see the road in the distance, partly visible now that the snow had settled. The road looked rough but passable. He felt something shift inside him, an uneasy mix of relief and sadness. Relief because the storm was gone and Naya would be able to return safely to her family. Sadness because her leaving meant the house would return to its old quiet state, the one he had lived in for years. He had grown used to silence, but after having someone share his home, the thought of the quiet returning felt heavier than before. Behind him, he heard soft footsteps. Naya had woken and was walking toward him, wrapped in the blanket she had used the night before. Her hair was a little messy from sleep, and her eyes were still warm with the comfort of rest. "Morning," she said gently, her voice soft and kind. "Morning," Elias replied, turning to face her. She stepped closer to the window, looking out at the bright snow. "It's beautiful today." "Yes," Elias said quietly. "The road looks better too." Naya's face changed slightly. She didn't look surprised, just thoughtful. "So I'll be able to go into town later." "Yes," Elias answered. "I can take you." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The air between them was gentle, but thick, with meaning they weren't sure how to express. Naya looked around the cozy room, then back at Elias. "These last 2 days feel different," she said softly. Elias nodded. "They do." He hesitated, then added, "It's been a long time since I had someone here." "No, I know," she replied quietly, "and I'm grateful you opened your home to me." Elias felt his chest grow warm, but the feeling mixed with a dull ache. He cleared his throat lightly. "Let's eat breakfast first," he said. "We'll head out after." Naya nodded, understanding that the moment was tender and needed gentleness. They cooked together in the quiet morning light. She cracked the eggs while Elias warmed the pan. Their movements were easy, almost familiar now, like people who had shared a home much longer than 2 nights. Sometimes their hands brushed when they reached for the same thing, and each time, neither of them pulled away too quickly. When they sat down to eat, the room felt peaceful. The fire crackled softly, filling the house with warm light. Naya ate slowly, savoring the meal. Elias watched her quietly now and then, noticing the softness in her expression. After they finished, Naya helped clean up, drying the dishes while Elias washed them. It was such a simple act, but it made the house feel alive, like a place where two people cared for each other in small, gentle ways. By late morning, the sun had warmed the roof enough to melt tiny icicles along the edges. Elias stepped outside to check the truck. Snow was piled around it. But the engine started after a few tries. Naya watched from the porch, her breath forming little clouds in the cold air. "It works," Elias said. "Good," she replied softly. They loaded her bag into the truck, the only bag she had carried on her trip. When Naya turned to look at the house again, she paused. Her eyes stayed on the porch, the door, the windows glowing with leftover warmth from the fire. "It's strange," she said, "but I feel like I'm leaving something behind." Elias swallowed, feeling a similar tug in his chest. "I know what you mean." They climbed into the truck. The ride toward town was slow, careful, and quiet. Snow crunched under the tires, and the white landscape stretched out beside them like a painting. Naya watched the fields with a thoughtful expression. "When I was walking last night," she said gently, "I prayed I would find help. I didn't know if I would make it. And now I feel grateful that the storm led me to your home." "I'm grateful too," Elias said honestly. Naya looked at him with soft surprise. He kept his eyes on the road, but she could see the truth in the set of his jaw and the warmth in his voice. A small smile touched her lips. When they reached town, the snow had been mostly cleared. The main streets were open, and people were walking about carefully. Elias parked near the cafe, where a few cars stood warming in the sun. Naya unbuckled her seatbelt slowly. "Thank you," she said, her voice more emotional now. "For everything." "You're welcome," Elias replied softly. "You take care, Naya." She nodded, but neither of them moved to open the door. They just sat there, looking at each other, feeling something deeper than simple gratitude. Something warm, something real. "I hope I'll see you again," she said quietly. Elias's breath caught, just a little. "I hope so too." She finally pushed the door open, stepping out into the cold sunshine. She closed the door gently and gave him one more grateful smile before heading toward the cafe to call her family. Elias watched her walk away, his chest tight in a way he didn't expect. When she disappeared inside the building, the truck suddenly felt emptier than it ever had. He sat for a minute, letting the feeling settle, then started the truck and headed back toward the ranch. The drive home felt longer than the drive into town. Each mile seemed to stretch more than usual. When he reached his property, he sat in the truck for a moment, staring at the house. It looked quiet again, too quiet. Inside, the warmth was still there, but the air felt softer, emptier. Elias hung his coat, walked to the fireplace, and stood there, thinking. The chair where Naya had slept the first night was empty now. The blanket she used was folded neatly on the armrest. The quiet settled around him, but it no longer felt like a familiar friend. It felt like a memory of something missing. Hours passed. Elias fed the animals, checked the fences, and stacked firewood, but everything felt different. He kept glancing at the road, knowing she was miles away now, but still half hoping she might return. He told himself not to expect anything. She had her family, her home, her life. He was just a rancher she had met in a storm. But the truth was, she had brought warmth to a place inside him that had been cold for too long. Evening settled in. Elias lit the fire again, sitting in his worn armchair. He tried to read a book, but his thoughts kept drifting to her smile, her soft laugh, the way she had watched the snow from his window. He sighed and set the book down. Then, just before the sun disappeared, he heard something. A car engine. Elias stood up quickly and walked to the window. A small car was pulling up the long dirt path toward his house. Snow flicked up behind the tires as it moved. His heart jumped before he could stop it. When the car stopped, the door opened, and Naya stepped out. Her hair lifted slightly in the cold breeze, and she held a small bag in her hand. She looked toward the house with a hopeful, warm smile. Elias opened the door and stepped onto the porch. "You came back," he said softly, unable to hide the surprise in his voice. "Yes," Naya said, walking closer. "I thought about leaving, and I did leave, but it didn't feel right. I kept thinking about this place. And you." Elias felt the warmth spread through him, slow and deep. I'm glad you came back. Naya stopped in front of him, her eyes glowing with the same quiet warmth he had felt growing during the last 2 days. I'm not here for shelter this time, she said softly. I'm here because I wanted to come back. Elias breathed out slowly, like someone finally letting go of years of held-in air. Then stay for as long as you like, he said. She smiled a smile full of promise, comfort, and a beginning neither of them had expected. Elias stepped aside, letting her into his home again. But this time the moment felt different. It wasn't a rescue anymore. It was a choice. The cowboy who had lived alone for 9 years watched as warmth returned not just to his home, but to his heart, carried by a woman who had once knocked on his door seeking warmth but had returned, offering her own.